Today we're going to talk about the top 6 Edelbrock carburetor measurements, how to do it, what to look for, and what you can ignore in the instructions and not pay any attention to. So let's get started. So about a month ago, I asked for some suggestions on what you'd like me to cover next on Edelbrock carburetors, and I got a really good one from eTribe Broker about measurements of the things that go on in the Edelbrock carburetor. And I understand where he was coming from. There's some things that are in the 1477 rebuild kit in the carburetor book that are a little confusing. So I want to just cover those really quickly today and show you the top 6 measurements that you need to make on this carburetor, and we'll cover them each one by one. But again, I'll try to take some of the confusion out of them, but honestly, once we get started in it, it's pretty self-explanatory. So we'll start rolling right in, and we'll cover them one by one. Now, the first common adjustment is the float adjustment, and these aren't very difficult, but there are a couple of things that you have to do first. So make sure that the float operates gently, easily, that there's no binding, sticking. Make sure that the pin is in, and I usually just kind of grab it from both sides. You can kind of feel it. That way it's, it's in on both sides of the tower here, and there's no obstruction there. The other side of it is just to make sure that the needle and seat is operating, and you can kind of just make sure by lifting it up and down, and that way you know that it's free and not sticking in there. If you just replace this or done a rebuild, it's a little bit easier. But if you're doing this on a carburetor that's been in service for a little while, it's always good to check those couple of things. Now, also too, is when you do the measurement on the floats, make sure that the gasket is in place because it does take up a little bit of space. Now, when you look in the instruction manual or the rebuild kit instructions, it'll tell you to take a 7/16 drill bit and lightly roll it underneath the float until it starts to move, and that will tell you what the depth is, or what the top side of it, or the amount of fuel that the carburetor is going to hold in it. This adjustment here is going to tell you how much fuel is going to be in the bowl. So what I do is I just roll the tip of the drill bit underneath it, and as soon as it starts to move up and you kind of get centered on the bit, that's kind of where you need to be at. Some people say, well, take it all the way into the middle, but there's really no way to keep a consistent measurement on that. There's no way to look at it and go, okay, well, I'm halfway in between the float here, maybe you'll screw it up a little bit. If you do it this way, it'll be consistent every time, and that's really what you're looking for, is consistency. So both floats on both sides of the carburetor and the bowls are exactly the same. So in this case, like I said, just roll it underneath there, and as it just starts to move up, that's where it is. Now this one's pretty close. We'll try the other side, and that one's pretty close as well. It's about halfway through the bit is where I look at it really start to moving up. So I would call those adjusted. And that's how you set the float level on the high side of the fuel. Now we'll talk about the float drop level and what it does. So to set the float drop, it's a little bit different because you're not measuring the whole float. What you're doing is you're just making a small adjustment on this little tang in the back, and what you're doing is trying to determine how far down or how low in the bowl that the float is going to go. And so in this case, this little tang on the back is stopped off the main body of the needle and seat, and that's how you make the adjustment. And it's this little tang here on the back. All you got to do is bend it. That way you get the right adjustment. Now within the rebuild kit, the 1477, it'll give you this nice easy paper ruler, so you can kind of get a determination of how deep it is. And all you do is turn the whole assembly upside down. Again, make sure the gasket is on there and it is up against the top of the carburetor flush, and then all you're doing is you're measuring it, and you're going to measure it to the very top of the float. And so all you need to do is to measure it, and I usually do the same thing. I try to measure it at the very end of it, and if it is close to that 15/16, great. If you need to bend this a little bit, all you do is bend that tab. If you bend it down like this just a little bit, it will restrict how deep it goes. If you open it up and bend it out, then the more that you bend it out, the deeper it'll drop. So if you make an adjustment on the tab, The closer in you go, you can see on here the tab how it stops itself up against there. The closer in you go, the less drop it is. The more you bend this out, the further that the drop will go. So all you're doing is just making a very, very small adjustment on that tang. Now typically I'll pop the float out of there to make that adjustment. I will not make it on the carburetor just because these are brass and you just want to be very gentle with them. But the bending and shaping of the this little tang and the height of it is not difficult. Just make sure you're very careful. Grab the main body of the float if you're going to do that, and make your adjustment here, and then hold this firmly, and then make your adjustments on the little tang, and that way you'll set the you can set both, and that's how you make the float height adjustment and the drop level on the float. Now, there's one other thing that we've talked about a little bit in the past, and the 7/16 drill bit is the common size that Edelbrock says to use, and I don't disagree with that. If you're running into some issues where you're having some hot starts, where you're having some flooding issues on it, and you need to go hold a little less fuel within the carburetor, you can use a 1/2-inch drill bit instead. Now, the 1/2-inch drill bit's kind of a double-edged sword because, yes, you will carry less fuel within the float bowls, and that's good, but you have to understand also that ethanol-based fuel, which most of the pump gas that you'll get today has at least 10% of ethanol in it. You do need more fuel on those types of fuel systems and carburetors to get the same amount of power that you would have gotten had you had no ethanol in it. So it's a little bit of a fine line we're walking here. If we're trying to control the heat and you're trying to keep a little bit less fuel in there, this is one way to do it, is set the float a little lower so you're not carrying as much fuel. But you could run into some issues if you get into some aggressive driving where you don't have enough fuel in the bowls to meet the demand of the engine. So it's a little bit of a tight line here. Most of the time I found that the 1/2-inch drill bit doesn't have that much effect on it. If you lower it much more than that, you do run into a situation where you could potentially not carry enough fuel. So it's just one little tip to be aware of when you're doing this. And typically these are the two adjustments that I make. I usually always start on the 7/16. If I need to go a little bit lower down the road, 1/2 inch is where I go to. Now let's talk about the electric choke, because this one will sometimes confuse some people. If you look in the instruction manual, the owner's manual, or the rebuild kit in the 1477, it will show you that there's this diagram here, and to take a little small piece of wire, 0.026 is the diameter on it, put it down this way, bend it this way, and what you're trying to do is determine how much it's opening up on the choke valve. Really, the only time that would be necessary is if this connecting rod on the choke would ever get bent, or you're concerned or not quite sure that it's operating correctly, or it's at the right angle. But quite honestly, unless you get into a situation where something really catastrophic happens, you drop the carburetor, I don't know what could happen, but I will tell you, in 30 years of doing this, I've only had to adjust that rod maybe 2 or 3 times. So pretty much you can go ahead and ignore that. I'm not telling you it's not valuable information. I'm just telling you most of the time you're not going to need it. So let's talk about how to adjust the choke. Now, the choke adjustment's very, very simple. It gives you some notches here on the side, one on the body, and then some little references to kind of reference going off of. If you turn the choke body, this black housing, counterclockwise, it will lean out the mixture. And if you watch the choke valve, it'll slowly open up as we make different adjustments as we turn it counterclockwise. If you go back clockwise, it closes the flap out, which means less air gets in, which means it's a richer mixture that goes down into the engine. And typically on an electric choke carburetor, we always start this about 2 ticks lean, and that way it'll give you just enough air to get in there, make sure it gets running, and hopefully you can make some adjustments from there. Now, if you get in fired up and it's stumbling and it's not hesitating and starting to not run right, then that way you can go here onto the main body and you can kind of tweak it a little bit. If you go a little bit more leaner, does it run a little bit smoother and get up to operating temperature a little bit quicker before the choke completely pulls open? Or is it very, very, hesitant and you need to go a little bit richer? Then you can always do that. But that base calibration where we were talking about a minute ago, bending the choke rod, and you get it right here in the center, you see this very, very small opening in the choke plate here, and that's what you're measuring there to when you put that little 026 rod in there. You're measuring that dimension there of how far that's open, and if you bend this rod at this base calibration, it will open or close that a little bit. But that's all you're doing. This is just a very fine adjustment point, but it's nice because you can kind of decide how much air you want to get into the carburetor when you're at full choke. Now this next measurement is just as critical as any other that you'll make on the carburetor, but it's not actually on the carburetor itself. And to show you that, we're going to have to go look underneath the hood of the truck. Now, one of the most critical adjustments you are ever going to make on a carburetor is certainly within how much pressure the carburetor sees. Now, it's not internal to the carburetor, but obviously you're going to have to add a pressure regulator and a gauge to this. But I will tell you that this piece right here, that pressure regulator and a gauge, is one of the most critical pieces to getting a carburetor set up right and to get it to run right. If you don't have this adjustment point here, then you've got no place to make it other than hopefully that the fuel pump is putting out the pressure that the manufacturer said it was. And almost in every case I've seen, it's had to be adjusted up or down depending on what the situation is. Even a mechanical pump that's factory rated at 6.5 psi, I've very rarely seen one that is. So do yourself a favor, put a pressure regulator on there and give yourself that other adjustment point. Now on an Edelbrock carburetor, I always start at 6 psi and tune down from there. And what I mean is, as you are working through the tuning of the carburetor and you realize that you need or may need a little bit less psi than 6, then go ahead and dial it down. Do about 1/2 pound at a time is usually the way I work it. But again, it's super critical to give yourself every advantage when you're working on these carburetors, and having just one more adjustment point is absolutely probably the best tip in this whole thing, is to go ahead and get yourself a pressure regulator, a good gauge, and that way you know exactly what's being delivered to the carburetor and you can make adjustments from there. But don't cheat yourself out of it. The carburetor will thank you, your tuning process will thank you, because you'll have so much more ability to do things and get it all dialed in the way it should be. Now let's talk about the next adjustment, and that's the accelerator pump. Now this is very, very simple and very easy, and the good thing about this is it doesn't require any other jets or rods or anything else. Everything is included right here with it, so you can make these adjustments on the fly before you even start tuning the carburetor. And a lot of times when we're working through the tuning process, I'll usually start here, and somebody says, well, I think it's running a little bit leaner and I need a little bit bigger shot of fuel, it's stumbling off idle, whatever. We'll make an adjustment here first, and that way we can determine, yes, you're on the right path, or no, you've got another issue like a vacuum leak, timing, or maybe it's the internals of the carburetor that you do actually need to make the adjustment on. But it's very, very simple. If you look here on the rod here that comes off the pump, you've got 3 different holes. Now typically these carburetors are set in the middle hole on a factory setting. Now sometimes that's not the case, so you have to kind of verify that with the carburetor. And if you go online, or if you look into the carburetor book or the tuning book, it'll tell you what the base calibration is. 1406, 1906, most of the common carburetors are right here in the middle, and that's where the base adjustment is. If you put the rod in the hole closest to the pivot point, you will get a bigger shot of fuel. If you put this in the one that's furthest away, you will get a smaller shot of fuel. Now that will throw some people off just a little bit. So just, if you don't remember that, then just reference it back through the book or through, online, and it'll tell you that. But those are very, very critical. And again, if you're trying to determine if you've got a lean spot or a spot where it's just too rich when you're rolling off idle, or you're from going at a dead stop to going all in, that's a really, really easy way to do that. And that adjustment, again, is just by popping that little clip out of the side and then pulling the connecting rod out and putting it in the hole you want to. In this case, we'll put it in the upper hole, and that'll give us the biggest shot of fuel. Or you can put it in the furthest hole out and it'll give you a smaller shot of fuel. But that adjustment there is one of the easiest ones to make, and sometimes it's a little confusing as to what you're going to get with it, but just make sure that you understand where the base calibration is on the carburetor, and then you can kind of determine from there what you need based on what the engine is demanding at those different RPMs that you're trying to tune it for. That's a really easy, nice, quick adjustment, and one that doesn't require any measuring, but it's obviously a critical one in the tuning process. Now, the next adjustment point, or the thing to check, is when the secondaries open. This is the primary side of the carburetor, this is the secondary. And as you notice, the primaries will open, and then the secondaries will just start to crack open. And that's what you're measuring, is when the secondary valves open. And why that's important is because a lot of different things. The secondaries on an Edelbrock carburetor are vacuum operated. Now, I know that looks mechanical as that is operating together, but the air valve on the top operates when the vacuum drops on the intake manifold side. It will release and open up the secondaries and allow the full metering of the fuel on the secondary side to occur. And that's why this is critical, is you have to understand when these are opening. That way everything will operate correctly. And again, you go back to the little paper ruler that Edelbrock provides in the rebuild kit, and you can measure that. And all you do is you crack open the primaries. Just as the secondaries start to tip open, you can put the little ruler on there and measure what the measurement is. And I think the Edelbrock is 1.3 centimeters. This is centimeters on, or millimeters on this side of the gauge. So that's what you're measuring, is how many 1.3, I guess it is what they say. But that's all you're doing. And if you need to adjust that, you can bend this little rod here to get it to open or close, or open a little bit quicker, or open at the time it needs to. But again, this is another one, unless that connecting rod has been bent, altered, distorted, you dropped the carburetor on this end of the of it, and it's bent, that rod, you most likely don't need to make this adjustment, but it's something to verify. Certainly, it's very, very quick, very, very easy, and all you're doing is verifying when the secondaries are cracking open. But again, there is a way to make that adjustment, and that little paper ruler is a nice little addition to your toolbox. I wish they had one that was plastic, but obviously you can get these at Harbor Freight or wherever you buy your tools from, and they're fairly inexpensive. Now, within the instructions, whether it's in the carburetor book or in the instructions on the rebuild kit, it will give you all of these little pieces to adjust and what the measurements are. And these are certainly very, very good to reference back to. So always hang on to the carburetor book. You're going to need it on the tuning side. And then if you do a rebuild, make sure you save that instruction little sheet that's in the 1477. It's kind of folded, kind of funky. It opens up to a really big piece, but it's very, very helpful down the road when you're trying to diagnose some problems, or just ensure that everything is set right as you go through the tuning process. Now, there are far more than 6 adjustments or measurements on this carburetor, but those are the 6 that really, really are the most important, and really the ones that are most critical for you to work on. Certainly the pressure regulator side isn't covered in the carburetor book or in the instructions here, but it is certainly one of the most critical ones to making sure that you have the ability to make all the other adjustments downstream of the regulator and the fuel pump to make sure that you get it right. So it's certainly one that, again, it's not in there, but it's got to be almost my number one adjustment on this, just simply because without it, everything else you do after that is really kind of redundant. So, the choke adjustment is certainly very important. The float drop and how much fuel you're carrying in the fuel bowls is very, very important. The accelerator pump adjustment's a nice, quick, easy one to get you some understanding of what's happening within the engine and where you need to adjust next. And certainly when the secondaries are opening is obviously a big critical piece to anything you're working on, because it'll let you know what the full operation and the timing is on that carburetor. So 6 very, very key pieces to the whole puzzle here. Well, I hope that cleared up some of the adjustments and measurements that you need to take on these carburetors to get them to get to this point where you can do the tuning process and know that all the little details are worked out before you start working on the big things, rod and jet changes and so forth. So certainly those are good base calibrations. They are a little bit of a moving target on some of them. When you talk about the level of fuel that's in it is an important one. Certainly the pressure coming to the carburetor is definitely a moving target. Again, on that one, you start at 6 psi and start to tune yourself down. So anyway, if you have any questions on any of that, please don't hesitate. Leave them down below. I'd love to help you with it. If you're not following me on Instagram or over on Rumble, please check me out over there as well. And again, I'm always happy to answer any questions, so please don't hesitate. Leave them down below. We will catch you guys on the next video. We'll see you.